Picture this: 20,000 feet above occupied France, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison gripped his parachute straps as flak exploded around his transport plane. Below him stretched the most heavily fortified coastline in human history, bristling with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and thousands of German troops who had been preparing for this moment for 4 years. What Morrison didn't know was that he was about to execute the most audacious military gamble in history, a secret operation so radical that even Allied commanders thought it was suicide. But here's what will shock you. This wasn't just another D-Day drop. This was Operation Thunderclap, a classified directive that would turn the entire concept of airborne warfare on its head. And most of the men jumping into that darkness had no idea they were guinea pigs in an experiment that would either save thousands of lives or doom them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm clouds gathered over England in the early hours of June 6, 1944, but the real tempest was brewing in the minds of Allied strategists who had spent months wrestling with an impossible problem. General Omar Bradley stared at the intelligence reports spread across his desk at Portsmouth, each page confirming what every planner already knew. The German Atlantic Wall was a death trap. Concrete bunkers, razor wire, and interlocking fields of fire turned every beach into a killing ground. Traditional naval bombardments had proven inadequate against reinforced positions, and even the most optimistic estimates suggested catastrophic casualties for the first wave of infantry. The challenge wasn't just tactical, it was mathematical. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had transformed the Norman coastline into a fortress system that could channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. Every approach route had been mapped, measured, and covered by overlapping defensive positions. Machine gun emplacements commanded clear views of potential landing sites, while mortar positions provided indirect fire support from concealed positions inland. Artillery batteries, protected by thick concrete casemates, could rain shells on any vessel approaching the shore. For the Allied forces preparing to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history, the calculations were sobering. How do you overcome defenses that had been 4 years in the making when you have perhaps 4 hours before German reinforcements arrive? The answer, according to conventional wisdom, lay in overwhelming firepower. Naval guns would pound the beaches, bombers would crater the defensive positions, and sheer numerical superiority would carry the day. But Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, commanding the 1st Allied Airborne Army, harbored doubts that gnawed at him during sleepless nights in his headquarters. He had seen what happened when paratroopers were dropped according to standard doctrine, scattered across vast areas, landing in isolated groups, struggling to find their equipment and link up with other units. The Sicily campaign had been a nightmare of missed drop zones and friendly fire incidents. Italy had shown that even successful airborne operations could turn into disasters if German reinforcements arrived too quickly. What troubled Brereton most was a classified report that had crossed his desk 3 months earlier. German intelligence had intercepted Allied communications, suggesting that massive airborne operations would precede any invasion attempt. Rommel had responded by flooding potential drop zones, installing wooden stakes topped with explosive charges, and repositioning reserve units to counter airborne threats. The element of surprise, the foundation of successful paratrooper operations, was evaporating before the first soldier had even boarded a transport plane. The crisis deepened when reconnaissance flights revealed the extent of German reinforcements. Preparations. Photographers returning from dangerous low-level missions brought back images that sent chills through the planning staff. Every field that could accommodate a glider landing had been sown with obstacles. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed potential approach routes. Most disturbing of all, crack Wehrmacht units had been repositioned to respond immediately to airborne landings. The German defenders weren't just waiting, they were ready. Yet, abandoning airborne operations wasn't an option. The success of Overlord depended on securing key bridges, road junctions, and communication centers behind enemy lines. Without airborne forces to disrupt German reinforcements and create confusion, the beach landings would face even stiffer resistance. The paratroopers had to jump, but conventional tactics promised disaster. What the Allies needed wasn't just more paratroopers, they needed a completely different approach to airborne warfare. The solution emerged from an unlikely source. Captain Maria Volkov, a Soviet liaison officer attached to Allied planning staff, had witnessed the defense of Stalingrad firsthand. She described how German paratroopers, when finally deployed against prepared positions, had been decimated not by superior firepower, but by their inability to concentrate forces quickly enough. The defenders had interior lines of communication and could mass troops at threatened points faster than scattered airborne units could consolidate. The traditional approach of dropping paratroopers across wide areas to create maximum disruption actually worked against them when facing a competent enemy who could respond rapidly. Volkov's observations sparked heated debates in secure conference rooms across southern England. Colonel David Eisenhower, nephew of the Supreme Allied Commander and himself an airborne planning specialist, argued for a radical departure from established doctrine. Instead of dispersing paratroopers across multiple drop zones to create widespread disruption, why not concentrate them in such overwhelming numbers at specific points that German defenders would be unable to respond effectively? The concept violated every principle of airborne warfare that had been developed since the first military parachute jumps. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. The idea was initially dismissed as fantasy. The logistics alone seemed impossible. How do you drop thousands of paratroopers in a concentrated area without creating massive casualties from mid-air collisions, equipment malfunctions, and landing injuries? The aircraft required would stretch Allied transport capacity beyond any previous operation. More importantly, concentrating forces made them vulnerable to German artillery and air attacks that could devastate entire units before they could disperse and seek cover. But as June approached and conventional solutions proved inadequate, the radical proposal gained supporters. Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, despite his reputation for caution, became an unexpected advocate. He argued that the concentrated drop would actually be safer than traditional scattered operations because it would allow paratroopers to establish defensive perimeters quickly and coordinate their actions instead of fighting isolated battles across the countryside. The psychological impact on German defenders would be enormous. Instead of dealing with small groups of scattered soldiers, they would face what appeared to be an invasion from above. The turning point came during a top-secret meeting at Churchill's War Rooms in late April. Present were only the most senior Allied commanders, sworn to absolute secrecy. General Montgomery laid out the challenge with characteristic bluntness. The current airborne plan would result in units scattered across 50 miles of French countryside, fighting desperate holding actions until ground forces could link up with survivors. The Germans had 4 years to prepare for exactly this scenario, and their response would be swift and brutal. What Montgomery proposed instead would later be codenamed Operation Ace.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Thunderclap. Though that designation wouldn't appear in official documents for another 2 weeks, the concept was elegantly simple and utterly terrifying. Instead of dropping the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions across multiple zones, concentrate both divisions in a space no larger than 10 square miles directly behind Utah Beach. The density would be unprecedented, nearly 20,000 paratroopers landing within minutes of each other in an area that could barely accommodate half that number under normal circumstances. The risks were staggering. Weather conditions would have to be perfect to prevent transport aircraft from colliding in the darkness. Drop zones would need to be cleared of obstacles without alerting German defenders. Most critically, the paratroopers themselves would have to execute a type of operation that had never been attempted on such a scale. Training time was limited, equipment was already allocated, and there was no opportunity for large-scale rehearsals that might compromise operational security. Yet the potential rewards justified the gamble. A concentrated drop would create an instant perimeter behind German coastal defenses, cutting off reinforcement routes and preventing the kind of coordinated counterattack that had nearly thrown Allied forces back into the sea during earlier amphibious operations. German artillery positions, designed to engage targets on the beaches, would be unable to provide effective support to their forward positions if they were threatened from behind by overwhelming airborne forces. The mathematics were compelling once planners worked through the details. Traditional airborne operations scattered forces across such wide areas that it typically took 6 to 12 hours for units to achieve effective strength at their objectives. During those crucial hours, German reserves could be repositioned, communications restored, and counterattacks organized. A concentrated drop would achieve maximum combat effectiveness within 30 minutes of the first paratrooper touching ground, faster than German forces could possibly respond. Planning for Thunderclap required reinventing airborne logistics from the ground up. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the youngest female officer ever assigned to Allied High Command, found herself tasked with solving problems that military theorists had considered impossible. How do you drop 20,000 soldiers and their equipment in a 10-mile radius without creating a traffic jam in the sky? Traditional doctrine called for aircraft to approach drop zones in single file, releasing paratroopers at precise intervals to ensure safe separation. Thunderclap demanded that dozens of transport planes arrive simultaneously over the same coordinates. Mitchell's solution was as brilliant as it was dangerous. Instead of approaching the drop zone from a single direction, transport aircraft would converge from 12 different vectors, arriving at staggered altitudes ranging from 800 to 3,000 feet. Each flight path was timed to the second, creating a three-dimensional choreography that would put paratroopers on the ground in a predetermined pattern without mid-air collisions. The margin for error was non-existent. Pilots would have to maintain precise speeds and headings despite anti-aircraft fire, weather conditions, and the natural tendency to take evasive action when under attack. Ground preparation was equally complex. Intelligence operatives, working with French resistance cells, identified a sector behind Utah Beach where the terrain offered both tactical advantages and sufficient space for the massive drop. The area included several small villages, agricultural fields, and a network of country roads that could be quickly secured and used to coordinate the consolidated force. More importantly, it was positioned to cut the main German supply routes to the coastal defenses while being far enough inland to avoid the heaviest anti-aircraft concentrations. But selecting the drop zone was only the beginning. The area had to be prepared without alerting German intelligence, which maintained extensive surveillance networks throughout occupied France. Resistance fighters, working under the cover of normal agricultural activities, began clearing obstacles from designated landing fields during the weeks preceding the invasion. Stakes were removed at night and replaced with camouflaged versions that would collapse under the weight of landing paratroopers. Explosive charges were neutralized, and alternate landing sites were prepared in case German forces discovered the primary zones. The human element proved as challenging as the technical aspects. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had trained for months in traditional small unit tactics, learning to operate independently after landing and to seek out other scattered forces. Thunderclap required them to unlearn those instincts and instead focus on immediate consolidation and rapid perimeter establishment. Veterans who had jumped in Sicily and Italy found themselves retraining alongside replacement soldiers who had never seen combat. Training facilities across England were modified to simulate the concentrated drop scenario. Mock-ups of French villages were constructed, and paratroopers practiced rapid assembly and deployment in confined spaces. The exercises revealed unexpected challenges. Soldiers trained to spread out and seek cover instinctively bunched together when landing in groups, creating vulnerable targets for enemy fire. Communication protocols had to be completely redesigned because traditional radio procedures couldn't handle the volume of simultaneous transmissions from concentrated forces. Perhaps most difficult was maintaining operational security while conducting realistic training. The unusual nature of the exercises inevitably attracted attention from personnel not cleared for Thunderclap details. Cover stories were developed suggesting that the intensive training was preparation for post-invasion operations in urban areas. Equipment modifications were explained as improvements based on lessons learned from previous campaigns. Even so, security officers worried that German intelligence might piece together enough information to anticipate the changed tactics. As May turned to June and the invasion date approached, final preparations took on increasing urgency. Weather forecasters studied atmospheric conditions with unprecedented precision, looking for the perfect window when winds would be light enough for accurate drops, but cloud cover would still provide concealment from German observers. Aircraft maintenance crews worked around the clock to ensure that every transport plane would be in perfect mechanical condition. A single engine failure could disrupt the carefully timed convergence and compromise the entire operation. The psychological pressure on everyone involved was immense. Pilots who had flown dozens of combat missions found themselves studying navigation charts for the 100th time, knowing that a minor deviation from planned routes could result in mid-air collisions or paratroopers landing in German-held territory. Paratroopers sharpened weapons and checked equipment with obsessive attention to detail, aware that they would be jumping into a type of operation that had never been attempted in military history. Intelligence reports from France provided both encouragement and concern. German forces appeared to be maintaining their defensive positions without indication that they anticipated the concentrated drop. However, the very success of operational security meant that Allied planners couldn't be certain their preparations had gone undetected. The possibility that German forces were waiting the concentrated firepower to devastate the landing zones couldn't be eliminated. Medical preparations reflected the unprecedented nature of the operation. Field hospitals were positioned closer to the landing beaches than ever before, and evacuation procedures were revised to handle the potential for mass casualties concentrated in a small area. Surgeons studied German defensive positions and anticipated wound types,
patterns, while medical supplies were pre-positioned based on worst-case scenarios for the concentrated drop. Equipment loadouts for paratroopers were revised to support rapid consolidation rather than independent operations. Instead of carrying maximum individual supplies, soldiers were equipped with specialized gear designed to support immediate group formation. Radio operators carried equipment powerful enough to coordinate battalion-sized units from the moment of landing. Demolition specialists were armed with charges designed to cut German communication lines and block reinforcement routes within minutes of touching down. The final briefings took place in secure hangars across southern England during the first days of June. Maps were unveiled showing drop zones marked with precision that would have been impossible just months earlier. Officers explained the coordination procedures that would turn 20,000 individual paratroopers into a coherent fighting force faster than any military unit had ever achieved. Questions were answered, equipment was inspected one final time, and soldiers prepared mentally for an operation that would either vindicate the most radical experiment in airborne warfare or become one of the greatest disasters in military history. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, checking his watch as transport aircraft engines warmed up on airfields across England, carried with him a classified folder containing the final operational orders for Thunderclap. The document represented months of planning, innovation, and risk-taking by some of the most brilliant military minds of the war. But success would ultimately depend on the courage and skill of thousands of paratroopers who would soon be jumping into the darkness over Nazi-occupied France, trusting that their commanders had made the right choice in abandoning everything they thought they knew about airborne warfare. The engines reached full power, and across England, the largest airborne armada in history began lifting off into the night sky. In cargo holds filled with nervous soldiers, the reality of Operation Thunderclap was about to be tested in the most unforgiving classroom of all: combat against an enemy who had spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment. The success or failure of the most ambitious airborne operation ever conceived would be determined in the next few hours, as the Norman sky prepared to rain paratroopers in numbers and concentration that would either save the invasion or doom it to catastrophic failure. The roar of hundreds of aircraft engines filled the pre-dawn darkness as the greatest airborne armada in history crossed the English Channel. Inside the cramped cargo holds of Douglas C-47 transport planes, paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces painted with camouflage grease, their weapons loaded and ready. Staff Sergeant William Hayes of the 82nd Airborne checked his watch for the dozenth time, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach that preceded every combat jump. But this time was different. Instead of the usual pre-jump briefing about scattered drop zones and independent operations, Hayes and his fellow paratroopers had been told they would be landing in the middle of what their commanders called the most concentrated airborne assault ever attempted. The first indication that Operation Thunderclap was proceeding according to plan came from the lead navigation aircraft, piloted by Major Catherine Reynolds. Flying at the head of the massive formation, Reynolds watched her instruments with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that any deviation from the planned route could result in catastrophic mid-air collisions when the formation reached its target coordinates. The weather conditions were perfect: light winds, scattered clouds providing concealment from German observers, and visibility good enough for accurate navigation. Through her headset, Reynolds heard the steady chatter of flight controllers coordinating the complex three-dimensional approach that would put 20,000 paratroopers on the ground within a 10-square-mile area. Below them, the coast of France appeared as a dark line against the slightly lighter waters of the Channel. German searchlights swept the sky in predetermined patterns, their beams probing for Allied aircraft that intelligence suggested would be approaching from traditional directions. The Luftwaffe had positioned its remaining night fighters along expected approach routes, waiting to pounce on scattered formations of transport aircraft flying predictable courses to widely separated drop zones. What they weren't prepared for was the concentrated mass of aircraft converging on a single point from 12 different directions simultaneously. The first German radar stations detected the approaching formations just 20 minutes before the scheduled drop time. Operators stared at their screens in confusion as dozens of aircraft appeared to be flying directly toward each other on collision courses. The unusual formation patterns didn't match any known Allied airborne doctrine, and precious minutes were lost while German controllers tried to interpret what they were seeing. By the time accurate reports reached forward commanders, the lead aircraft were already approaching the drop zone coordinates. Lieutenant Thomas Anderson, jump master aboard one of the lead C-47s, stood at the open door of his aircraft, watching for the visual markers that would signal the beginning of the drop. Below him, the French countryside was still shrouded in darkness, but he could make out the distinctive road junctions and village outlines that matched his memorized map coordinates. Around his aircraft, dozens of other transport planes maintained precise formation positions, despite the anti-aircraft fire that was beginning to blossom in the sky ahead. The Germans were shooting, but their fire was scattered and uncoordinated because they couldn't determine the intended target of such an unusual formation. The drop zone itself had been transformed during the preceding weeks through the careful work of French resistance operatives working under the direction of British Special Operations executive agents. Captain Jean-Luc Dubois, a former French army officer turned resistance leader, had spent months coordinating the ground preparation necessary to support such a massive, concentrated landing. Fields had been cleared of obstacles without alerting German patrols. Landing markers had been pre-positioned, and communication networks had been established to provide immediate intelligence on German defensive reactions. As the first paratroopers began jumping into the Norman darkness, the true audacity of Operation Thunderclap became apparent. Instead of the traditional scattered drops that spread forces across vast areas, soldiers were landing within hundreds of yards of each other, creating an instant concentration of combat power that had never been achieved in airborne operations. Sergeant Hayes hit the ground hard in a small pasture, rolled to absorb the impact, and immediately began the rapid assembly procedures that had been drilled into every paratrooper during the intensive training period preceding the invasion. The sound of aircraft engines continued to fill the sky as wave after wave of transport planes arrived over the drop zone. The carefully choreographed approach patterns were working exactly as planned, with aircraft arriving from multiple directions at staggered altitudes to avoid collisions, while maintaining the rapid delivery of personnel necessary for the operation's success. German anti-aircraft gunners, positioned to defend against approaches from expected directions, found themselves unable to concentrate their fire effectively against targets arriving simultaneously from all compass points. Corporal Maria Santos of the 101st Airborne landed in a small orchard just 300 yards from her designated assembly point, closer to her planned position than any combat jump she had ever made. Around her, other paratroopers were landing with similar precision,
their white parachutes visible against the dark ground for only seconds before soldiers collapsed and concealed their distinctive silhouettes. The concentration was so dense that Santos could hear the voices of other soldiers calling out recognition signals in multiple directions, something that typically took hours to achieve in conventional airborne operations. German forward observation posts began reporting the airborne landings within minutes of the first paratroopers touching ground. But their reports were so contradictory that headquarters initially dismissed them as panic reactions from nervous sentries. The observers described paratroopers landing everywhere simultaneously, covering areas that should have required multiple divisions to occupy. German commanders, trained to respond to scattered airborne landings by positioning reserves to contain isolated groups of enemy soldiers, found themselves facing a situation that didn't match any tactical scenario they had studied. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. Machine gun crews positioned to defend against seaborne landings suddenly found themselves surrounded by airborne forces that had appeared seemingly from nowhere in overwhelming numbers. Artillery positions designed to support coastal defenses were cut off from their communication networks within minutes as concentrated groups of paratroopers moved with unprecedented coordination to secure key objectives. The standard German response to airborne operations, sending small units to hunt down scattered groups of enemy soldiers, was completely inappropriate against such concentrated opposition. Major Richard Foster, commanding a battalion of the 82nd Airborne, established his command post in a stone farmhouse just 15 minutes after landing, a speed of organization that would have been impossible under traditional airborne doctrine. Around him, his companies were reporting successful assembly and were already moving toward their assigned objectives. The concentration of forces meant that instead of spending hours searching for scattered personnel and equipment, commanders could focus immediately on offensive operations against German defensive positions. The first major engagement occurred when advance elements of Foster's battalion encountered a German strongpoint controlling the main road intersection that connected coastal defenses with inland reserve positions. Under normal circumstances, such a position would have required hours of preparation and careful coordination between scattered airborne units to assault successfully. Instead, Foster was able to coordinate simultaneous attacks from 3 directions, using forces that had landed within a mile of each other and maintained communication throughout the assembly process. Sergeant Hayes found himself part of a demolition team, tasked with destroying a critical bridge that German reinforcements would need to reach the coastal positions. The bridge was defended by a reinforced platoon of Wehrmacht troops positioned in concrete bunkers on both sides of the river crossing. Traditional airborne doctrine would have required such a mission to be conducted by a small, lightly equipped force operating independently until ground forces could provide support. Instead, Hayes's team was backed by an entire company of paratroopers who had assembled within 30 minutes of landing and could provide immediate fire support and reinforcement. The destruction of the bridge demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the concentrated drop strategy. German defenders, expecting to face small groups of scattered paratroopers, found themselves overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from multiple directions supported by heavy weapons that had been accurately delivered to predetermined positions. Within 2 hours of the initial landings, Foster's battalion had secured every major road junction in their sector and established defensive positions that would have required an entire German division to dislodge. Similar successes were being reported across the entire drop zone as the concentrated approach proved its worth in engagement after engagement.
Rodriguez, commanding a company of the 101st Airborne, led an assault on a German communications center that controlled defensive coordination for a 20-mile stretch of coastline. Her attack was supported by artillery observers who had landed with precise equipment and could immediately direct fire from naval guns positioned offshore. The German facility, designed to withstand attack by small commando units, was completely overwhelmed by the coordinated assault of an entire airborne company, supported by accurate indirect fire.
The German response to the concentrated airborne landings revealed the fundamental weakness in their defensive planning. Reserve units had been positioned to respond to scattered threats across a wide area, making it impossible to concentrate sufficient forces to counter the massive airborne presence that had appeared behind their coastal positions. Orders went out for scattered garrison units to abandon their positions and converge on the airborne landing area. But these movements exposed German forces to attacks by French resistance units that had been coordinated with the airborne operation. French resistance leader Captain Dubois activated networks that had been carefully prepared during the months preceding the invasion. Communication lines were cut, supply convoys were ambushed, and German commanders found themselves unable to coordinate an effective response to the airborne threat. The concentrated drop had not only put unprecedented numbers of Allied soldiers behind German lines, but had also triggered a coordinated uprising that multiplied the chaos facing German defenders. By dawn on June 6th, just 4 hours after the first paratroopers had landed, the effectiveness of Operation Thunderclap was undeniable. Instead of the scattered groups of isolated soldiers that German forces expected to face, the concentrated airborne assault had created a coherent force controlling a 10-square-mile area directly behind the most critical section of German coastal defenses. Road networks were cut, communication centers were destroyed, and artillery positions found themselves unable to support forward defensive positions because they were under direct attack from coordinated airborne forces. The link-up between airborne and seaborne forces occurred with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. When elements of the 4th Infantry Division pushed inland from Utah Beach, they encountered not scattered groups of paratroopers who had been fighting individual holding actions, but organized airborne units holding prepared defensive positions and ready to support the advance inland. The concentrated drop had achieved in 4 hours what traditional airborne operations typically required 2 days to accomplish. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, observing the success of his portion of the operation from a captured German observation post, could hardly believe the transformation that concentrated tactics had achieved. Around him, staff officers were coordinating with multiple airborne units simultaneously instead of trying to locate scattered forces and coordinate their individual actions. Radio networks were functioning effectively because operators had been able to establish proper communication procedures immediately after landing, instead of operating in isolation until other units could be located. The German counterattack, when it finally materialized, demonstrated both the desperation of the defenders and the complete success of the concentrated airborne strategy. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division, rushed from reserve positions inland, found themselves attacking prepared defensive positions held by concentrated airborne forces, instead of hunting scattered groups of paratroopers across the countryside. The Panzer attack, which might have succeeded against traditional scattered airborne landings, was stopped cold by coordinated anti-tank defenses that had been established within hours of the initial drop. Sergeant Hayes, manning an anti-tank gun position overlooking the main approach route to the drop zone, watched German armor advance directly into interlocking fields of fire that had been carefully planned and coordinated between multiple airborne units. The concentration of forces meant that defensive positions could be mutually supporting instead of isolated strongpoints that could be overcome individually. When the Panzer attack was finally repulsed, German commanders realized that they were facing not the scattered remnants of an airborne operation, but a coherent force that had achieved tactical cohesion faster than any military unit in history. The psychological impact of Operation Thunderclap extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. German units across the entire Atlantic Wall received reports of massive airborne landings that had achieved unprecedented concentration and effectiveness. Commanders who had spent 4 years preparing to counter airborne operations found their tactical doctrines completely inadequate against concentrated airborne assault. The success of Thunderclap became a model that would influence airborne operations for the remainder of the war and beyond. Medical evacuation procedures, redesigned to support the concentrated operation, proved their worth as wounded paratroopers could be treated and evacuated with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. Field hospitals established within the secured area could provide immediate care instead of requiring dangerous evacuations across hostile territory. The concentration of forces meant that medical personnel could be protected and supplied more effectively than in traditional scattered operations. The intelligence value of the concentrated operation exceeded all expectations. Instead of scattered units reporting fragmentary information about German positions and movements, coordinated reconnaissance efforts provided complete tactical intelligence about enemy dispositions across the entire sector. German communication intercepts, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations were processed immediately by intelligence specialists who had landed with the initial assault forces and established functioning analysis capabilities within hours of the drop. Captain Rodriguez, consolidating her positions as German resistance collapsed throughout her sector, reflected on the transformation that concentrated tactics had brought to airborne warfare. Instead of the isolation and uncertainty that characterized traditional paratrooper operations, her soldiers had fought as part of a coordinated team from the moment they landed. Equipment that had been accurately delivered to predetermined positions meant that heavy weapons were available immediately instead of after hours of searching and recovery operations. The supply situation, always critical in airborne operations, was revolutionized by the concentrated approach. Instead of scattered equipment bundles that might be located by enemy forces or lost entirely, supplies were delivered to secure areas controlled by concentrated forces immediately after landing. Ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment were available when needed, instead of requiring dangerous recovery missions across hostile territory. French civilian populations in the secured area provided immediate and enthusiastic support for the airborne forces, having been prepared by resistance networks for the arrival of Allied soldiers. Instead of scattered encounters with individual paratroopers, civilians could provide coordinated assistance to organized units that clearly controlled the area and could protect civilian supporters from German retaliation. The final German attempts to contain the airborne operation demonstrated the complete failure of traditional counter-airborne tactics against concentrated forces. Artillery barrages, directed at suspected paratrooper positions, found themselves targeting empty fields, while the actual airborne forces had consolidated in prepared positions that provided mutual support and coordinated defense. Infantry attacks, designed to overwhelm isolated groups of paratroopers, instead encountered concentrated defensive fires from multiple directions. As the morning of June 6th progressed and the success of the beach landings became apparent, the strategic value of Operation Thunderclap was undeniable. The concentrated airborne assault had not only secured critical objectives behind German coastal defenses, but had created the conditions for rapid exploitation by seaborne forces advancing inland. Instead of fighting through prepared defensive positions, Allied ground forces found German defenders already disorganized and cut off from their support systems. The lessons learned from Operation Thunderclap would revolutionize airborne doctrine for the remainder of World War II and influence military planning for decades afterward. The concentration of forces that had seemed impossibly dangerous during the planning phase had proven to be not only feasible, but devastatingly effective against defenders prepared to counter traditional scattered operations. Military theorists would study the operation for years, analyzing how concentrated airborne assault could achieve tactical objectives that had previously required much larger forces operating over extended periods. Major Foster, surveying the battlefield from his command post as German resistance collapsed throughout the sector, knew that he had participated in something unprecedented in military history. The concentrated drop had transformed 20,000 individual paratroopers into a coherent fighting force faster than any military unit had ever achieved. The tactical cohesion that typically required days of consolidation had been accomplished in hours, giving Allied forces an advantage that German defenders had never anticipated and could not counter effectively. The success of Operation Thunderclap validated the most radical experiment in airborne warfare ever attempted.
What had begun as a desperate response to seemingly insurmountable defensive preparations had become a new paradigm for airborne operations. The concentrated approach had achieved everything its planners had hoped for, and more, proving that innovative tactics could overcome even the most prepared defensive positions when executed with precision and coordination. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. German commanders across Europe would be forced to reconsider their defensive planning in light of the concentrated airborne threat that had appeared without warning and achieved unprecedented effectiveness. Reserve positioning, communication networks, and counterattack procedures would all require revision to address a threat that existing doctrine had not anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, compiling his after-action report as organized German resistance ceased throughout the airborne sector, documented not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of airborne warfare. The concentrated approach had proven that properly coordinated airborne forces could achieve strategic objectives that had previously been considered beyond the capabilities of paratrooper units operating behind enemy lines. The human cost of Operation Thunderclap had been far lower than anticipated despite the unprecedented risks of the concentrated approach. Casualties from landing injuries, typically high in scattered operations where medical assistance was delayed, were minimized by the immediate availability of medical personnel and evacuation capabilities. Combat losses were reduced by the rapid achievement of tactical coordination that allowed defensive positions to be mutually supporting instead of isolated and vulnerable to defeat in detail. The equipment recovery rate exceeded all expectations as concentrated forces could secure and protect supply drops instead of leaving equipment scattered across hostile territory. Heavy weapons that typically required hours or days to recover in position were operational within minutes of landing, providing immediate fire support capabilities that traditional airborne operations could not achieve.
Communication equipment functioned effectively because operators could establish proper networks immediately instead of operating in isolation until scattered units could be located and coordinated. As Allied ground forces advanced inland from the beaches and linked up with airborne units, the full scope of Operation Thunderclap's success became apparent. Instead of scattered holdouts fighting desperate, delaying actions until relief arrived, organized airborne forces held prepared positions and were ready to support continued offensive operations. The concentrated approach had not only achieved its immediate objectives, but had created the foundation for rapid exploitation that would accelerate the entire campaign. The German military response to the concentrated airborne assault revealed fundamental weaknesses in defensive doctrine that had been developed to counter scattered threats. Counterattack procedures designed to overwhelm isolated paratrooper units were completely inadequate against concentrated forces holding mutually supporting positions. Intelligence gathering and target identification procedures failed when faced with coordinated deception and security measures implemented by organized airborne units. The strategic deception achieved by Operation Thunderclap extended the tactical success into operational advantage. German reserves committed to counter the airborne threat were not available to reinforce coastal defenses against the primary seaborne assault. Command attention focused on the unprecedented airborne concentration diverted resources from other critical defensive requirements. The concentrated drop had achieved not only its immediate tactical objectives, but had contributed to the overall success of the invasion through strategic misdirection of German defensive efforts. Captain Dubois, coordinating French resistance activities in support of the consolidated airborne forces, witnessed the transformation of guerrilla operations that had been carefully planned during months of preparation. Instead of supporting scattered groups of paratroopers fighting individual actions, resistance networks could coordinate with organized military units capable of providing mutual protection and support. The success of the concentrated approach had validated not only innovative airborne tactics, but also the integration of conventional and unconventional forces in ways that previous operations had not achieved. The technological innovations developed to support Operation Thunderclap, from navigation aids that enabled precise formation flying to communication equipment that functioned effectively in concentrated operations, would influence military development for years to come. The precision, timing, and coordination required for the successful execution of concentrated airborne assault drove advances in multiple areas of military technology and procedure. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, and the success of the Normandy invasion became undeniable, Operation Thunderclap stood as perhaps the most successful application of innovative military thinking under extreme pressure. The 20,000 paratroopers who had jumped into the Norman darkness had validated the most audacious military gamble of the war and established principles that would influence airborne operations for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.